Hello and welcome to episode 34 of The Board. I'm Gavin Coughlin, an Agile coach here at Boost Agile, and today we're going to be talking about Scrum versus Kanban. And I know that's not the correct pronunciation of Kanban, but we've been trying all morning. We just can't do it.
Yeah, we've actually got Ruka, who's behind the camera here. She's actually Japanese, and we've been asking her for correct pronunciation, but we failed miserably. So let's not go there.
An Englishman and an Irishman just can't do it.
Yeah.
And this is
Paul Llewellyn. I'm also an Agile coach here at Boost.
So the reason that this whole Scrum versus Kanban came up recently, and why I'm interested, why we're talking about it today, is because I did a training yesterday with a group, and they were new to Agile. They had a vague idea about some of the concepts, but they were new about it. Like, for example, they didn't know the values and stuff. They just knew bits and pieces. And I was talking to them about Scrum and Kanban, and they wanted to start with Kanban, and I was a little bit concerned because they didn't work in an Agile way, and Kanban is a little bit free form. I feel, and I thought Scrum would be a good place for these people to start, because they're all software, so they're just in a perfect situation. They have teams of less than 9 people, between 5 to 9 people, so in a really good position to move to Scrum. And I think Scrum gives you obviously very strict sort of fixed rules and things to do, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing for somebody who's new to it. And just wanted to talk about that. Some of your thoughts about this as well, Scrum versus Kanban, and when is it good to move to Kanban, when is it good to move to Scrum, and what the main differences are. So should we start talking about the differences first?
Yeah, let's do that, and then we can talk a bit about the origins and where it came from and why it works that way.
Yeah.
But the main difference, I think, is that Scrum limits work in progress by limiting the amount of work that's in the sprint backlog. So each iteration, the team commit or forecast how much work they can complete, and that becomes their work in progress, if you like. That's the work they will complete, and so that's how Scrum limits work in progress. And then Kanban does it slightly differently. It has a backlog, but the backlog, you don't commit to a certain amount of work. You don't work in iterations necessarily. I mean, most Kanban systems don't work in iterations, and they and so the backlog is prioritized, but you just pull the next thing from the top of the backlog into whichever column.
And the columns will have work in progress limits, so you can only have 2 items in, say, one column and 3 items in another.
And so, and the work in progress limits worked out by the team. Something that you have to really work on as part of your Kanban system is when what works well. I mean, it's probably, if you've got 3 developers and a couple of testers, then it's probably going to be 3 in the development WIP and then 2 in the test column. But of course, it doesn't always work like that. People work together, and so. But the other problem is, of course, if you've got 3 in development, you might overload the testers quite quickly. And so work in progress limits, or WIP as it's called, is something that you refine as you go along, and just to sort of give you some ideas of why that is, the Kanban comes from manufacturing, and Kanban, it was originally the Toyota production system. They've been using Kanban since the 1950s. A guy called Taiichi Ono, who came up with this concept of Kanban just means message, or something. It's a token essentially. It indicates when a piece of work should be done. And he got the idea from supermarkets, from supermarket shelves, because you don't try to put stock onto shelves that's already fully stocked. No, that's right.
Or because it just doesn't work. So you wait until some of that stock has already been taken off by customers, and then you put the stock on. So it's a pull system rather than a push system. You're trying to push the products on there, and that's another big aspect of Kanban, that it is a pull system.
Yeah, and so is Scrum.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen people say otherwise, but if it's a push system, there's something broken there.
Yeah, that's right.
It shouldn't be.
Yeah. And so, and Kanban, the pull nature of it means that, I mean, they used to think in manufacturing that you spent all of that money on machines. If they were sitting around idle, then you were wasting money, essentially. So you used to people would try and fully utilise their machines and their staff, and of course, so if you're making components for a product, and you need so you know the machine that makes component A is a lot faster than the machine that makes component B, but you need equal amounts of component A to component B.
Yeah.
Then the temptation is to get the machine that builds your component A and get it producing as many component A's as it can.
Mm-hmm.
And then you soon get a surplus of component A's, and then if the production or the product changes and component A becomes redundant, and you've got all of that waste. And of course, so that's what Kanban tries to avoid is overproduction, and realizing that it's not efficient just to have machines running.
Mm-hmm.
It's not efficient to have machines running. Oh, so we've got a couple of questions from Petty here. Good.
She says, "Come on, guys, it's easy to say Kanban. It's not. We've been trying all morning.
Kanban.
We've been Kanban. It's the best I could do. I'm not sure that's right."
And you know, I'm very tempted, Petty, to put an Australian accent on the way you've put it there. So
Kanban.
But anyway, let's not dwell on how to pronounce Kanban.
So we could spend half an hour trying to do that. It would be enjoyable for us, but I'm not sure for anybody else.
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of teams who are using Scrum, and they feel like they feel restricted by some of the rules, by the.
Well, they feel Scrum's too prescriptive.
Yeah, and they feel they have those meetings are taking up too much time, and they feel some teams are getting burnt out, which obviously I think means something's going wrong there as well. So they want to switch to Kanban because it is there's no meetings prescribed and there's no iterations, and for a lot of people, I mean, that works. And for a lot of people, it doesn't work because I think when you move from Scrum to Kanban, sometimes you lose that urgency that Scrum gives you, which isn't a bad thing. It's you're trying to complete your sprint backlog before the sprint is actually over. Whereas Kanban, there's no sprint, so that like I said, the sense of urgency.
Yeah, but you still have that around individual items in the Kanban system. If suddenly you start getting a block in one area, for example, then the easiest way to unblock is to either to put more people into into clearing that block, to doing the work in that column. So if suddenly test becomes overburdened, then you take some of the developers, or some of the developers will go from the what they're doing and help the test team.
I think that's from the Toyota production line as well, because they have a system where if somebody finds an issue, they press stop and everything, and everybody gathers around and tries to fix out the problem. Looks like we have a couple more questions there. Penny Morgan says the biggest complaint I hear is too many meetings in Scrum, but they are efficient enough if your communication between meetings is good enough. The meetings shouldn't be dragged out, and that's one thing that came up yesterday when I was training this group in Agile, and we talked about Scrum, and they said there's so many meetings there. When do you have time to actually do work? And I said, well, there's a whole middle period of the sprint there where you shouldn't have these big long meetings, and the meetings in Scrum are there to provide real value, and they should be time boxed meetings, pretty strictly time boxed, and if people don't get the value out of it in time, they should learn through they can learn through failure. So if they haven't done their sprint planning by the time that say 2-hour time box ends, just cut it off anyway. But there's meetings that should be providing real concise good value each time you're actually holding them.
That's right.
And if they're not, there's a problem with the meeting there, I think.
And they're asking, are we building the right thing? Are we building it right? And they're looking for feedback on as quickly as possible to validate that you're doing those things.
And a lot of people who use Kanban, they still have retrospectives, for example. They might call them Kaizen meetings, which Kaizen means continuous improvement.
The small incremental changes, that's right.
Changes, so people still have some of those meetings in place, but I suppose the planning meeting doesn't really happen. And the daily stand-ups don't necessarily have to happen either. No,
but that's the thing. I think they do happen in Kanban. They do. They just happen at a more granular level. And that's so that those meetings still happen. Someone is still going to sit down with a product owner and prioritise the backlog. There's no doubt about that. There's still going to be those product backlog grooming or whatever you want to call it.
Yes.
Then, in terms of planning, there isn't a need for a planning meeting. That's true because you're not planning iterations, but you're still you're just you're going based on the priority of the product owner's
Yeah.
backlog, you're just pulling the next item off, so no need for planning. But then, most people will have a coordination meeting at some point in the day, even using Kanban. They will do a daily stand-up. Most people will, like you said, do some form of Kaizen, which in Scrum is the retrospective.
Yeah.
But in Kanban, it's when something breaks, there's a block in your system or whatever it is, then everybody stops. And in Toyota, on the production line, they stop the entire production line, and they have this policy of go see. So go see is where all of the management involved, all of the people involved, and plus management will gather around the particular part of the production line that stopped and work out what the problem is, and they will do some root cause analysis.
And I think one thing that Kanban really helps there is because the three main tenets of Kanban are limit your work in progress.
That's right.
Visualize your workflow.
Yeah.
And keep the workflow happening with a pull system, right?
That's right. And so, and optimize your workflow.
Optimize your workflow, yeah. And
that's right.
I think the visualizing your workflow with these columns with limits of work in progress really help to see where a bottleneck is happening and where people do need to implement that sort of that stop system from the Toyota methodology or whatever you want to call it, where everybody does say, there's a lot of build up in testing. Let's all see what we can do there and see what we can do to unblock that column so we can keep work flowing through.
That's right.
And it's really easy to see when that's happening in Kanban, and that's what's so great about visualizing your workflow. And I mean, if you don't do anything else in Agile, making your workflow visible is going to be really, really useful for people, I think.
Absolutely. And the thing with I actually prefer Kanban's approach to stop and see or go see, is that you're fixing the problems as they pop up.
Yeah.
And what often happens with Scrum is you wait until the retrospective, and then people have often forgotten what the burning issues were at the beginning of the sprint, for example. And so I like Kanban's approach in that sense, but those, like I said, you're still spending time improving your process. And I think it would be bad not to. I think.
Yeah. Well, I think like the people I was talking to yesterday who are new to Agile and everything, I think Scrum is a good way to start, because the four Agile values, the framework of Scrum really helps those happen. Just because you're doing Scrum doesn't mean you're Agile, but it certainly helps, because you have the iterations, which is helping you get the working software out there quickly. You have the meetings, which is helping the customer collaboration and also the individuals and interactions, and as well the iterations and the backlogs really help with responding to change. And so are the reviews and the planning sessions as well. So I think it's really good training wheels, and I can't help but feel people jumping into Kanban are going in ill-equipped with actually being Agile. But what do you think, and this is possibly not a question you can even answer, how do you know if a team's talking to you and they want to be Agile and they say, should we go with Kanban or Scrum? How do you gauge that? Is that even possible to do?
I think it is. I mean, I'm currently talking to a team at the moment who are considering Kanban for their operations. The key thing, I think Scrum fosters a better sense of collaboration between the team, because they have to work together with the product owner. So there's much more conversation that happens around the user stories as they get ready to come into the sprint, and then as they get worked on in the sprint, there's much more conversation. I think the danger with Kanban is it can, so an individual can just go and pull the next work item, and they don't necessarily have a conversation that involves the entire team, and they certainly might not, so they certainly won't have that conversation, and they probably won't have a conversation with the product owner. They will just get on with the work they're doing. So it works well for tasks where the work is known, or it can be worked, or analysed and worked out. But I don't think it works well for stories, in the way you're building something with unknowns or uncertainties, i.e. new technology or new ideas, and you don't know how to implement those. You need to collaborate quite heavily on those types of user story. So I don't know, I haven't answered your original question. I've gone off on a bit of my own.
Well, no, I think that answers it a little bit. I mean, I did ask you, how detailed when the team approaches you, whether Scrum or Kanban is the right thing for you, and you're basically saying that Scrum is good for teams where they're working with a lot of unknowns, and Kanban is good for teams when they're working with a lot of
it's more known,
more known stuff, and they already have sort of planned out tasks that they have to do rather than, like you said, stories.
And what I've seen as well is that people who do Kanban where there are unknowns, they end up integrating some of the Scrum meetings into that. So they will have, like I said, daily stand-ups, and then they will also have retrospectives. They'll have a fixed period of time, which isn't the end of an iteration, but it will be every couple of weeks where they're retrospective, to make sure they can, is there anything they can do?
They often start working in iterations as well, so it becomes Scrumban. I've heard that term.
That's right.
Thrown around a lot. And Scrumban seems basically like Scrum, just with a different
type of backlog.
Yeah.
So and then the key thing there is that Scrum kind of fixes the backlog in place for the sprint, so that the developers are working with a kind of some knowns at least within their work, whereas Kanban, the priorities can change and shift, assuming the work hasn't already been started on that particular backlog item.
And I think another time when a team can move to Kanban, I feel if they've been using Scrum for a long time and they're really an agile team, they're a high-performing agile team, they've got those 4 values and they're living by them. They're not just going through the motions. They really understand the benefits of being agile, and that's just the way they are at that point. I think then it's that they can make the move to Kanban fully confident that they're still going to adhere to the agile values.
That's right.
And it's like that whole shu ha re thing. I think shu, when you're learning and you don't really know the rules, possibly then Scrum is a good thing because it gives you that framework. And then ha, when you can start modifying things a little bit and bring some of your own flavor into it, and then re, when you are basically making up your own rules, you've thrown away the rule book a little bit. And obviously to get to that last point, you need to go through those first 2 stages. That's right. So you're saying basically taking off the training wheels that Scrum provides. Just going to check. I think we've got. Ruka's just chatting away. So Petty's come back and said, but just in reference to the meetings, and there's too many meetings. But if they are efficient enough, if your communication between meetings is good enough, then the meeting should be dragged out. Sorry, that's just Patty's earlier point. That's right, and I do believe that that's some of the key stuff that Scrum fosters is that collaboration, so that you don't have the meetings we find don't last anywhere near their time boxes, apart from the retrospective maybe. And that whole customer collaboration that Scrum does foster. For example, we've got a situation here where we're working on a project and the product owner comes in for the stand-ups and then is not co-located for the rest of the day, but is in contact a lot by email. But we're actually going to get them in at least for a couple of days a week now, because there's so many emails that we just know if they're here in the office, it will save so much time and the communication will be so much better. And it's fantastic that they can actually give us the time to do that, and obviously shows their commitment to the project as well. But it's having them here is going to just make, I think, life a lot easier and more efficient for those couple of days. So Kanban obviously doesn't have product owners.
No, but they do have that kind of. There is that role in product development. If you use Kanban for product development, then obviously you need someone who has ownership of the vision essentially, and the budget. I think those are still essential for the success of a Kanban project for product development. It's worth going back to the fact and just reiterating that Kanban does come from manufacturing, and Scrum comes from product development. And Kanban operates kind of uses principles of lean, and Don Reinertson's book, Principles of Product Development Flow. He's really started to cross that over. Some of the lean kind of ideas are starting to cross over into product development now, in terms of lean manufacturing concepts are now being slotted into the product development sort of space. But the key thing is with product development is when you're manufacturing, you've worked out most of your unknowns already, and then you're just going into a production process. Whereas when you're actually building a product, you're building something completely new from scratch. Lots of uncertainties, new technologies, new ideas, unknowns involved in building that. So you need a more empirical process, and Scrum really fosters that empirical process. That's one of the you're experimenting to see if something works. if the experiment works, then you amplify the experiment. If it doesn't work, you dampen the experiment and you try something different.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the real key things. And if you're in product, if you're building a brand new product and you're in the early stages of that, then Scrum, I think, is essential.
Yeah.
Kanban really works well in terms of operations or business as usual, where you've got a continuous flow of work, and the flows, especially in operations where the work is often coming from different sources.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, I think we've got another comment there.
Okay.
Paul's just going to check that.
Yeah.
So I think we'll just see what.
It's from Tony. There's a good and free book called Kanban and Scrum: Making the Best of Both it's by Henrik Nieberg on InfoQ. That's right.
Yeah,
Tony.
that is a free download, like Tony says there, and it is very good. So we'll put a link up to that on live stream after the show as well, and we both had a look at it. It is a very good white paper.
Yeah, what I really like is, even though it's 120 pages, it's really lots of illustrations, and there's a particularly good section which is the day in the life of a Kanban, and then there's also or One Day in Kanban Land. It's called One Day in Kanban Land, and then the first section, the first half of it is just a description of Scrum versus Kanban and the differences, and then the second part of the document is a case study, which is, I think, around operations and
I used some of the concepts from that to explain the differences to those guys yesterday that I was talking, the differences between Kanban and Scrum. So I think, is there anything else you want to discuss?
Well, just on that note, Nieberg has written a number of good texts, and one of those is called Lean from the Trenches, which is about a project he did with the Swedish police a few years ago, and they were using Kanban, a massive Kanban board, to manage that project. And so I really recommend it. It's not a very long book. It's called Lean from the Trenches, and it just talks about the kind of things that they ran into while they were running what I really liked was some of the concepts where they were not necessarily anything to do with Kanban, but they were, for example, they limited themselves to 30 bugs, and they never had more than 30 bugs.
Oh yeah, can you explain that actually? Because I heard you. Well, I know about it. I'd just like you to explain that whole concept, because I think it's a great idea and a good way to get people out of a certain rut.
Yeah, we've got the same issue here in one of our projects. It's been going on for 5 years. We've got a bug tracker, which has got hundreds of bugs in it, none of which are, or very few of which are relevant to the current state of the system. But no one's got time to actually go through and triage or remove those bugs. We did try. We spent a few days about 6 months ago, maybe a year ago, trying to clear up the system, and realised when we were, I can't think of an expression that isn't rude.
Yes.
Pushing stuff uphill.
Yes.
We realised we were pushing stuff uphill quite badly. So the concept that Nieberg and this team came up with was that they only ever had 30 bugs, ever. There were 30 slots. If a bug came up that was more important than one of the bugs in the top 30, then you worked out where it went, which bug it replaced, and you slotted that bug out and you put this bug in. And so it meant that they were constantly only focused on the top priority bugs, and if a bug came back, then what's naturally going to happen is if a bug's important or it keeps recurring, then it will come back into the top 30 at some point, and they will fix it.
I just love that idea, because just having a list of 30 bugs is mentally just so much easier to approach than this ever expanding list of bugs, which just seems insurmountable and becomes impossible to actually prioritize. And having that fixed limit of just 30 in there, I think is really great, and I'd be interested to try that on a project. Yeah,
and the key thing to understand with that approach as well was they were trying to fix bugs. They had a system which isolated and found bugs as quickly as possible, and so those bugs wouldn't get recorded if that was still in development. That particular product backlog item was still in development, then they wouldn't even bother recording those bugs. They would just get them written on pink post-it notes and fed back to the developers to fix. And often the testers would go and work with the developers to fix those bugs pair style, so those bugs that made it into the top 30 list were only ever bugs that are what we call escapees from the,
so out in production
or system test or something like in a wider test somewhere else. And so I think it was but basically production, escapees.
Okay, I just wanted to ask you about that. I know it's a bit off topic with Kanban versus Scrum, but I think this is a really interesting idea.
Well, their Kanban board actually had the top 10 features, the top 5 tech stories, which are like architecture stories, and then they had the top 5 bugs. And so that was how they kept filling those slots. So and they worked out who was allocated to features, who was allocated to tech stories, and who was allocated to bugs, and they would work that. So whoever was allocated to features would pull the top from the top 10 features and so on.
And just before we go as well, I wanted to talk about an image that you sent around, which I found quite interesting, because in your Kanban boards you can have different columns and different people have different columns. Sometimes you sent around a really interesting one the other day. There was a team who wasn't adhering to their definition of done, which is sometimes a problem.
You can use this in Scrum as well. This doesn't need to be restricted to Kanban.
Absolutely, and so because they weren't looking at their definition of done or making sure they were going through their definition of done, they made each column an item from that definition of done. So a card had to go through each of those columns until it got into the done column, and that really obviously ensured and made visible that every item was being really absolutely done and complete.
That's right. So they had columns like browser tested, automated test written, document written, docs written, and so on. So each column was one of an item from their definition of done. It worked really well, and it did. And in Kanban systems, what they do is they each column has the set of rules, the definition of done rules for meaning it can go from that lane to the next lane, assuming there's space in that lane, i.e. the work in progress limits. There is availability or a slot in the next lane. But so they explicitly state their definition of done under each column on the Kanban board. I
think that's a really nice idea if people are forgetting about their definition of done, or if you just don't feel the definition of done is actually being adhered to. So I think that's about it for today. Really. So thank you very much. We will be uploading this to YouTube as well, and we'll put a link underneath this to that white paper that Tony mentioned about Kanban and Scrum and how to make them work together. I think that's the theme of it, making the best of both. So thanks very much, and we'll see you in 2 weeks' time.
Thank you. See you soon.